Making videos for you is very satisfying. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers to inspire us more and more every day. Thank you very much. It began on a night when the world seemed ordinary, yet destiny had quietly written an extraordinary chapter. Inside a grand auction house where crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections across velvet curtains, silence hung in the air like a sacred ritual. The wealthy and the powerful sat in hushed anticipation, their eyes shifting between the stage and their auction cards, their hearts ready to chase rare treasures that few could ever dream of possessing. Among them sat a man who had everything, at least that's what the world believed. A millionaire whose fortune stretched across continents, whose collection of rare artifacts could rival that of museums. Yet, despite his wealth, despite his endless vaults filled with objects of beauty, he often felt a hollow space within him, one that no possession had ever managed to fill. He attended auctions not for the thrill of ownership, but out of habit, as though by surrounding himself with history, art, and relics, he might stumble upon something that gave meaning to the silence in his heart. And that evening, when the velvet cloth was pulled away to reveal the painting, his world shifted. At first it seemed simple, an old canvas framed in wood carved with delicate patterns, its gold leaf faded and chipped with age. Yet as the light touched the portrait, time itself seemed to pause. Gasps echoed softly among the crowd, but the millionaire heard nothing. His gaze was fixed on the image of the woman who seemed to rise out of the painting as though she had stepped from reality itself. Her face was unforgettable, not because it carried the perfection of nobility or the polished grace of queens, but because it held a beauty that felt raw, real, almost too alive for the confines of canvas. Her eyes were the first thing he noticed, eyes that seemed to pierce through centuries, eyes that carried the weight of secrets untold. They were not passive, not still. They seemed to move with emotion, as if the artist had captured not a likeness, but a soul. Her lips bore the faintest trace of a smile, but it was no ordinary smile. It was caught between melancholy and hope, a mystery that beckoned the viewer to look longer, to search for the story she carried. Her hair, painted in soft strokes, fell loosely around her shoulders. Unlike the styled and jeweled figures of her time, she was natural, untamed, as though she belonged not to palaces, but to the free air of the streets. And for reasons he could not explain, the millionaire felt something stir inside him. Recognition. It was not admiration, not mere fascination, it was the chilling, electric sensation of knowing someone, though he was certain he had never seen her before. The auctioneer's voice rang out, naming a starting price that would have left most men breathless, but the collector barely noticed. His eyes never left the woman on the canvas. His heart pounded with a strange urgency, as if losing this painting would mean losing a part of himself. Hands lifted across the room. The numbers climbed higher, each bid like a duel fought with invisible swords. But he did not flinch. His hand rose with calm certainty, again and again, until the battle dwindled and all other competitors surrendered. The hammer fell. The painting was his. Polite applause followed, but the millionaire remained still, his gaze locked on her image. The world around him blurred, voices fading to whispers he no longer heard. The moment attendants lifted the portrait and carried it away, he felt an emptiness, as though she had taken a piece of him with her. When the painting finally arrived at his estate, he ordered it placed in a private room. No one else would lay eyes upon her. He dismissed his staff, locked the doors, and stood in silence before her. Candlelight flickered across her features, giving life to the illusion that she breathed, that she might step out of the frame at any moment. He studied her for hours, days, weeks. Time lost meaning, meals grew cold, meetings were missed. His vast empire could crumble around him, and he would not care, for he had found something greater than wealth, the mystery of the woman who seemed alive within painted strokes. But questions consumed him. Who was she? What hand had painted her? Why had no records of her name survived? He summoned art historians, experts, scholars from around the world. They examined the canvas with magnifying glasses, traced the brush strokes, debated its origins. Some argued she was a merchant's daughter, others believed she had been a secret lover to a forgotten artist. but their theories felt hollow. None could answer with certainty, and yet, as he stood before her, he felt something they did not. The truth, he believed, was not lost in history. It was here, alive, hidden in her eyes. One night, as moonlight spilled through tall windows and silvered her features, he whispered aloud, "Who are you?" The room was silent. Yet in that silence, something shifted. Her painted eyes seemed deeper, darker, filled with a knowing that unsettled him. He began to dream of her. In those dreams, she was not trapped in oils and canvas. She was real. He saw her walking streets he did not recognize, heard her laughter carried on the wind, smelled the faint trace of paint on her hands. He woke each morning convinced that she had been there, that her presence lingered in the room. The line between art and life blurred. Once in a dream so vivid it stole his breath, he reached for her hand and felt it, warm and alive, before waking in a cold sweat. It was madness, he knew, and yet he embraced it. The millionaire who once thought himself a master of possessions now found himself possessed. The painting was no longer an object. It was a mirror to his soul, a doorway to a mystery that would consume him until the end. He was no longer the man who collected treasures. He was the man who had been claimed by a single face, a single unknown woman whose story was yet to be uncovered. And in the silence of his mansion, surrounded by wealth beyond imagination, he whispered a vow. "I will find you." When the painting entered his life, it did not simply decorate his walls. It rewrote the very structure of his days. The millionaire had lived in a world of excess, surrounded by possessions so rare that their value was measured in millions, yet none of them had ever stirred his soul. Until her. The woman in the painting was not merely art. She was presence, and her presence began to dominate every breath he took. At first it was subtle. He would pause longer than expected before the painting, admiring the delicate way light touched her features. He would linger in the room late into the night, unwilling to leave her alone in the silence. He told himself it was curiosity, an interest in unraveling the history behind the portrait. But with each passing day, the truth became undeniable. He was no longer a man who looked at a painting. He was a man who lived with her. Every morning the staff would find him seated in front of the canvas, coffee untouched, eyes locked on hers. Business calls went unanswered, deals fell through, yet he did not care. The fortune he had once fought to expand now seemed trivial compared to the mystery hanging on his wall. He wanted nothing else. Sleep no longer offered rest. The woman followed him into his dreams, her painted smile transforming into something alive, her gaze shifting as though she truly saw him. Sometimes she walked through streets, bathed in sunlight, places unfamiliar yet hauntingly real. Other times she sat in shadows, her face half hidden, as though daring him to search for her truth. When he awoke, he could still feel her presence, like a fragrance that lingers even after its source has vanished. He began to speak to her quietly at first, like a man ashamed of his own madness. But in time, shame gave way to need. He whispered stories of his life, confessions of loneliness hidden beneath riches, secrets he had never shared with another soul. And though she never spoke back, the silence was never empty. Her eyes answered, her smile responded. He began to believe she listened. It was obsession, yes, but not the shallow obsession of a collector greedy for beauty. This was different. This was personal. This was intimate. The millionaire who had bought countless treasures for their value now desired nothing but truth. The truth of who she was, where she had come from, and why fate had placed her in his path. He called upon experts once more, but not for their appraisal of the painting's worth. He demanded answers. He hired genealogists, archivists, art historians, anyone who could trace the origin of the canvas. They scoured archives, searched auction records, traced brushstrokes to forgotten schools of art. But again, nothing certain emerged. And yet, his conviction only grew stronger. She was not a ghost of the past. Something in her eyes told him she belonged to the present. He could not explain why he believed it, only that he did. It was irrational, defying logic, but his heart insisted she was alive, The obsession began to reshape his world. His once bustling mansion grew silent as he withdrew from society. Friends invited him to gatherings, but he declined. Associates begged for his attention in business matters, but he ignored them. Even the servants whispered about their master's strange behavior, though none dared question him. He surrounded himself with sketches of her. He hired artists to replicate details of the painting, to experiment with modern interpretations, as though by studying her from different angles he might uncover her essence. His study became a shrine, walls lined with her image. One evening, after weeks of sleepless nights, he caught his own reflection in the glass of the painting's frame. He hardly recognized himself. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, yet his expression burned with intensity. For the first time in years, he was alive. Obsessed, yes, but alive. He laughed softly, realizing the irony. The man who had everything had become prisoner to one mystery. The woman who had nothing more than paint and canvas had conquered him without lifting a finger. But obsession is not content to remain still. It demands movement, action, discovery. The millionaire felt the weight of his vow pressing heavier each day. I will find you. And so, he began to search not with historians, but with investigators. Private detectives, skilled in tracing the untraceable, were hired to uncover what scholars could not. They searched not in dusty archives, but in living streets, among whispers and rumors. He instructed them not to search for the artist, but for the woman herself. They looked at him with confusion. Sir, this woman must have lived centuries ago. But he only shook his head. No, she is alive. The detectives left, perhaps doubting his sanity, but money silenced their questions. They began their work. Weeks passed. Leads emerged and dissolved. Portraits resembling her appeared in different collections, but none matched. Yet he remained patient, because patience was the rhythm of obsession. Then came a night unlike the others. He sat before the painting as he always did, candlelight flickering across her features. For the first time, he dared to imagine her stepping out of the frame, walking across the room, her voice breaking the silence. The thought was so vivid that he spoke aloud. "Where are you? Tell me and I will come." The room remained silent, but his heart, restless and unyielding, beat with an answer it had already chosen. She was out there, waiting. And he would not stop until he found her. The obsession had awakened fully now. It was no longer curiosity, no longer admiration. It was a fire consuming him, a hunger that could not be ignored. For the millionaire, there was no turning back. The painting had given him a promise, though it had spoken no words. Somewhere in the world the woman existed. Not a dream, not a shadow. Real. And he would cross every border, spend every coin, and sacrifice every comfort until the day he stood face to face with her. The obsession had begun, and it would change his life forever. The search had consumed weeks, then months, but time no longer mattered to the millionaire. Each day was measured not by hours, but by distance covered, reports gathered, possibilities chased. His investigators traveled across cities, through dusty archives and crowded markets, while he remained restless in his mansion, torn between staring at the painting and pacing like a man imprisoned by his own obsession. The world whispered about his strange withdrawal. Newspapers speculated that the great collector had lost interest in wealth, that perhaps illness kept him hidden. Few knew the truth, that he was not losing himself, but chasing the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive. And then one evening, as the last light of the sun sank behind the skyline, the call came. One of his men, a detective hardened by years of chasing illusions, spoke with hesitation in his voice. "Sir, I believe we've found her." The words struck like thunder. The millionaire's heart pounded. He gripped the phone tighter. Where? The address was nothing like he had imagined. Not a palace, not a forgotten noble estate, but a crowded street corner in a district known more for its noise than its beauty. His mind reeled. Could it be possible? Could the woman whose face hung in his private gallery, whose portrait had survived centuries, truly be walking among strangers unnoticed? The next morning, before dawn had fully painted the horizon, he set out. For a man who had lived in opulence, the journey felt strangely humbling. The car left behind the polished glass towers of his world and entered streets alive with music, with voices, with the raw chaos of daily life. Vendors shouted their wares, children darted through alleys, the scent of roasted food mingled with the smoke of traffic. And then he saw her. She was not framed in gold, not elevated on a pedestal, not worshipped as a priceless treasure. She stood barefoot on cracked pavement, a simple stool beneath her, a canvas propped on an easel. In her hands, a brush danced with colors that spilled like music across white cloth. Around her, passers-by slowed, some dropping coins into a small tin at her feet, others pausing only long enough to marvel before rushing on with their lives. The millionaire's breath caught in his chest. It was her. The same eyes, the same curve of lips, the same presence that had haunted him through nights of restless dreams. She was older than the woman in the painting, perhaps, but only in the way reality carries time. Her essence was unchanged. She was alive. For a long moment he could not move. The world narrowed until there was nothing but her, strokes of paint in her hands, strands of hair escaping the tie at the back of her head. She hummed softly as she worked, unaware of the weight her existence carried for the man watching. And then something struck him harder than recognition. She was struggling. Her clothes were worn, her shoes patched, her tin barely half filled. She lived not as a muse admired by kings, but as a street artist, surviving day by day with the fragile currency of talent and hope. The millionaire's chest tightened. How could the world not see what he saw? How could they pass her by as if she were ordinary, when her very being was extraordinary? He stepped closer, his shoes too polished, his presence too heavy for the simplicity of the scene. People noticed him. Men in suits always drew attention here, but she did not. She was lost in her work, her brush moving with rhythm, her world contained within the colors she mixed and shaped. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. It was not the dramatic recognition he had imagined. She did not gasp, did not freeze. Her gaze lingered on him no longer than on any stranger who paused by her canvas. Yet for him, that moment shattered everything, because in her eyes, alive and unpainted, he saw the same depth, the same unspoken mystery that had captured him from the canvas. He wanted to speak, but his throat tightened. He who had spoken in boardrooms with confidence, who had commanded the attention of empires, found himself speechless before a woman who did not even know his name. Finally, she tilted her head and offered a polite smile. "Would you like to see?" she asked, gesturing to the canvas she was painting. Her voice was music, not trained, not theatrical, but genuine, carrying the softness of someone used to speaking to strangers who might or might not care. He stepped closer. The painting she worked on was simple, a child chasing a kite, colors bright and joyful. It was not the kind of art auction houses would fight over, yet it carried something priceless: truth. You are an artist," he murmured, more to himself than to her. She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "An artist, maybe. A dreamer with brushes, perhaps. But here on the streets, dreams are small." He wanted to tell her everything, that her face hung in his mansion, that her image had survived centuries, that she was the reason he breathed. But the words stuck in his chest. How could he explain without sounding mad? So instead he asked, "What's your name?" She told him, and the sound etched itself into his soul like a sacred vow. That night, when he returned to his mansion, he stood before the ancient painting once more. The canvas woman and the street artist were one, and yet they were worlds apart. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "I've found you." But even as joy flooded him, another truth settled in his heart. She had no idea. She did not know the painting existed, did not know her image had been immortalized, did not know she had become the obsession of a man who could buy anything but her heart. And as he looked between the painted mystery and the living woman he had met, a question grew louder within him. What was destiny asking of him? To protect her, to possess her, or to love her? The search was over, but the story had only just begun. The discovery changed everything. Yet it also opened a chasm the millionaire had never expected. For weeks, he lived with the knowledge that the woman from the painting, the woman who had haunted his dreams and stolen his peace, was not only real, but alive, breathing in the same city as him. She was not a distant ghost locked in history, but flesh and blood, her laughter echoing against the walls of crowded streets. But there was a cruel contrast between their lives. He lived in marble halls, where silence pressed like velvet against the walls, where meals were served on porcelain worth more than most people earned in a year. She lived on pavements cracked with neglect, her meals uncertain, her art exchanged for coins that barely kept her afloat. He owned treasures so rare that they were guarded day and night, yet she owned little more than her brushes and her will to survive. The worlds they inhabited could not have been further apart, yet destiny had chosen to tie them together with a single thread: the painting. For days after seeing her, he remained paralyzed. How could he approach her? How could he explain the unexplainable truth, that she had been captured on canvas centuries ago, that her image hung in his private gallery like a relic from another life? Would she laugh at him, fear him, reject him? Yet he could not stay away. Each day he returned to that corner where she painted, standing at a distance, blending into the flow of strangers. He watched her paint for children who begged for their portraits, for couples who wanted a memory sketched in color, for tourists who snapped photos of her as though she were another curiosity of the street. And all the while, he saw her the way no one else did, not as a struggling artist, not as a woman fighting to be noticed, but as the living muse who had already conquered eternity. The contrast gnawed at him. How could the world fail to see her worth? How could they toss coins into her tin when her very existence was priceless? Finally, he approached her again. She greeted him with the same polite smile she gave to all, not recognizing him as the man who had stood watching night after night. He commissioned a painting, though not because he wanted the canvas. What he wanted was time. Time to hear her voice, to watch her hands move, to see her eyes light with concentration. When she handed him the finished work, a simple sketch of a rose, delicate yet powerful, he held it as though it were more valuable than all his collections. "How much?" he asked. She shrugged, embarrassed. "Whatever you wish to give. Enough to buy dinner would be kind." Dinner. The word pierced him. For her, art was survival. For him, art was an obsession. They were the same, and yet utterly different. He handed her a sum far beyond what she expected. She protested, but he insisted, masking his desperation with a smile. From that day, he became her silent patron. He bought everything she painted, sometimes openly, sometimes through others. Her work began to sell faster, not because the world had suddenly recognized her talent, but because he ensured she would never again go hungry. Yet she did not know. To her, he was still just another face in the crowd, a stranger whose presence grew more familiar with each passing day. But the closer he drew, the more dangerous the collision of their worlds became. He belonged to circles where power was measured in millions, where a signature could topple companies. She belonged to streets where every coin mattered, where trust was earned not through wealth but through sincerity. One evening he invited her to a gallery, one of the most prestigious in the city. She hesitated, unused to such spaces, but curiosity won. Dressed in her simplest clothes, she entered halls filled with chandeliers and polished floors. Eyes turned toward her, curious, judgmental, assessing. She felt small, misplaced, yet he walked beside her with a quiet pride, as though she belonged more than any of them. When they stopped before a masterpiece worth millions, he leaned close and whispered, "Do you know what I see when I look at this?" She shook her head. "I see less beauty than I do when I look at your work." Her cheeks flushed, and she laughed softly, as though dismissing his words as exaggeration. Yet something in his tone unsettled her. It was not the flattery of a man trying to charm. It was conviction. That night, after he drove her back to her corner of the city, she sat awake long after, staring at the few coins she had earned that day, and wondered why a man of such wealth would bother with her at all. But as their encounters grew more frequent, so did the tension between their worlds. She teased him for the way he carried himself, too careful, too polished. He admired her for her freedom, her refusal to bow to expectations. They clashed in small ways, over how money should be spent, over what defined success, over the meaning of art itself. "You see art as something to own," she once told him, her eyes fierce. "I see it as something to share. That is the difference between us." He fell silent because her words cut deeper than she knew. For him, ownership had always been the goal. Yet with her, he began to realize that ownership was an illusion. He could buy every painting she ever made, but he could never own the light in her eyes, the laughter in her voice, the soul that painted without expectation. And it terrified him, because he wanted her, not as he wanted other possessions, not as another trophy in his collection, but as the one thing he could not control, could not buy, could not command. The worlds had collided, and in that collision, something fragile and dangerous bloomed. He had found her. He had saved her from hunger, from obscurity. Yet he knew with every passing day that the one thing he wanted most, the only treasure he could not live without, was the one thing she might never give: her heart. There comes a moment in every story where desire meets decision, where one heart tries to reach another, not with words of affection, but with the weight of promises and power. For the millionaire collector, that moment arrived when he finally stood before the woman whose face he had first encountered, not in life, but in oil strokes and cracked varnish on a forgotten canvas. He had searched for her through archives, through rumors, through endless whispers of art dealers who never thought the mystery could be solved. And then he had found her. Not in a palace, not in a gallery, not in a circle of fame, but on the streets, crouched on cold stone, painting with chalks and brushes as if her very breath depended on it. She was not the immortal muse he had imagined, but something far greater, a living soul who painted not for wealth, but for the raw necessity of expression. And yet when he looked at her, he felt the same pull as the day he had first locked eyes with her painted likeness. She was the same, and yet entirely different, not frozen, not captured, but alive, untouchable. That realization unsettled him, because all his life beauty had been something he could possess, until now. So he crafted an offer. It began gently, with words meant to flatter. He told her how he had seen her work, how the world deserved to see it too, how her gift was not meant to vanish with the rain when her chalk drawings dissolved into puddles. He spoke of galleries, of grand openings, of exhibitions where critics would write her name in glowing reviews. He described a life without hunger, without worry, where she could paint endlessly, free from the weight of survival. But beneath his eloquence was a bargain. He wanted not just her art, but her. At first she listened in silence. She did not interrupt, nor smile, nor frown. Her eyes stayed steady, like someone watching a storm roll in, waiting to see whether it would pass or consume everything in its path. The more he spoke, the more urgent his voice became, as if afraid that silence was already her refusal. So he sweetened the offer. He spoke of wealth she had never imagined, not in coins dropped into a hat, but in numbers so vast they could rebuild entire lives. He promised her freedom from cold nights and hunger, from obscurity and struggle. He could buy every painting she would ever make. He could ensure that her name was remembered, carved into the annals of art history beside the greatest masters. But the truth, unspoken yet undeniable, was this. He wished to own not just her creations, but the creator herself. And then came the moment he could not resist, the confession disguised as an offer. He told her that since the day he found her likeness on the canvas, he had thought of nothing else. He told her that her face, her presence, her very existence had become the center of his world, and in his desperation, he laid out the words that betrayed everything. "Let me buy everything you are, your work, your time, your life. I will give you the world if only you give yourself to me." The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. For a long moment she looked at him, and then she smiled, not with cruelty, but with a calmness that startled him more than rejection. It was the smile of someone who saw through the glitter of his offer and reached the truth at its core. "You speak of freedom," she said softly, "but your offer is a cage. You promise the world, but only if I surrender myself. You want not an artist, but ownership. And my art, my soul, my heart, they are not commodities." Her words struck like lightning. The collector felt something collapse inside him. All his life he had built his identity around the belief that anything, given the right price, could belong to him. And yet here she was, the woman who had haunted his days and nights, telling him that the most valuable things could not be purchased. Still, he tried once more. His voice cracked now, stripped of grandeur, trembling with the vulnerability he had always hidden. "Do you not understand? I love you. I have loved you since before I even knew you lived. I don't want to lose you now." Her expression softened, but her answer remained firm. "You don't love me. You love the idea of me, the woman in the painting, the mystery, the muse. But I am not an idea. I am flesh, blood, breath, choice, and choice means I cannot be bought." Those words burned more than any rejection, because deep within he knew she was right. His obsession had begun with an image, an illusion, not with her reality. And reality could not be controlled. For the first time, the man who had everything realized there was something his money could never touch, the freedom of a heart that belonged only to itself. And so, the tempting offer lingered in the air, not as a promise of love, but as proof of its absence. He had offered her the world. She had given him the truth. And the truth was this: love is not a contract, it is not a purchase, it is not a signature on the dotted line of destiny. It is a gift, freely given, or it does not exist at all. In that moment, he saw her more clearly than ever before. Not as a muse, not as a painting, not as a possession, but as a woman who belonged to herself. And in that realization, he discovered something both devastating and beautiful: that the heart he wanted most could never be his to buy. It could only be his to cherish if one day she chose to give it. There are truths in life that arrive like sudden storms. At first, they sweep through everything we know, shaking the foundations of our beliefs, tearing down the illusions we once thought indestructible. And when they pass, what remains is not ruin, but clarity. For the collector, the man who had spent his life purchasing beauty, this storm arrived in the form of a single sentence, spoken softly, yet with the strength of an unbreakable vow. "You can buy every canvas I will ever paint, but not my heart. That is not for sale." Those words did not echo like anger. They did not strike with bitterness. Instead, they lingered with the serene finality of truth, and it was this quiet certainty that undid him more than any fury ever could. He had stood before kings of the art world, before rival collectors, before the weight of entire auctions, and he had always won. His wallet was power. His name was influence. His presence in a room meant that whatever he desired would eventually belong to him. But here, before this woman, this street artist who lived in simplicity and struggle, he was powerless. For the first time in his life, he faced something beyond the reach of wealth. Her refusal was not an act of rebellion, but of freedom. She was not resisting him to wound his pride. She was simply telling him that her heart was not an object. And he, who had built an empire of ownership, had never encountered something so utterly incorruptible. In the silence that followed, the world seemed to still. He searched her face, hoping to find hesitation, a flicker of doubt, something that might give him leverage. But her eyes remained steady, carrying both kindness and firmness. They told him, without words, that she had lived through hunger, through solitude, through rejection, and had come out unbroken. No promise of luxury could tempt her to surrender the one thing that made her free, her ability to choose whom to love. And in that moment, he saw her not as the woman from the painting, not as a mystery solved, not as a possession waiting to be claimed, but as herself, entire, unyielding, and radiant in her independence. He tried to speak, but words failed. For a man who had once charmed boardrooms, negotiated with billionaires, and outbid the most ruthless competitors, this was the most difficult negotiation of all, because it was not a negotiation. It was life teaching him a lesson. He left her that day with his offer unanswered, but his heart unsettled. His car drove him back to his mansion, past streets filled with lights, past towering glass buildings, past the silent monuments of wealth that once gave him pride. Yet none of it mattered now. Every wall, every ceiling, every gilded frame felt hollow compared to her words. That night, He stood in the gallery of his collection, surrounded by treasures worth more than some countries. He stared at the painting, her painting, the one that had begun this entire journey. Her painted eyes, frozen in time, seemed almost alive, but he knew now that they were only shadows of the real woman, and he whispered to the canvas, almost ashamed, "I tried to buy her, and she refused. And perhaps that refusal is the only thing that makes her truly priceless." The days that followed were restless. He found himself wandering without purpose, seeking not the comfort of auctions or the thrill of acquisitions, but the simple presence of the woman who had told him no. He returned to the street where she painted, no longer as a collector seeking a muse, but as a man humbled by truth. Sometimes he stood in the crowd, anonymous, watching her work. Children would gather, their laughter bright against the grey stones, and she would smile at them in ways she never smiled at him. And he realized something profound. Love was not something to be demanded. It was something to be invited and only freely given in return. There were moments when he thought of speaking again, of reminding her of his wealth, of offering her yet another version of the life he could create for her. But each time, he stopped himself. Because deep within, he knew that if he had to buy her love, it would never be love at all. And so he chose silence, But silence, though difficult, became his teacher. In silence, he learned to admire her, not as an object of desire, but as a person. In silence, he understood that true beauty is not in the owning, but in the witnessing. And in silence, he realized that the very freedom with which she lived her life was the essence of what he loved about her. The painting in his mansion remained, but it no longer filled him with the pride of possession. Instead, it humbled him. It reminded him of what he could never own, and yet what he could treasure far more deeply, the lesson she had given him. Because the truth was this: the greatest masterpiece of all was not the portrait he bought for millions. It was the woman who had the courage to say no. And through that no, she gave him the gift he had never expected, the ability to see love not as a prize, not as a conquest, but as something sacred, something fragile, something untouchable. In time, he stopped trying to buy her. He stopped offering promises, stopped dangling fortunes. Instead, he simply showed up. Sometimes he would stand at a distance, watching her paint. Sometimes he would leave quietly, without her ever knowing he had been there. And sometimes, when chance allowed, their eyes would meet, and she would smile at him. Not the smile of surrender, but the smile of acknowledgement, as if to say, "You are learning." And in those fleeting moments, he felt something richer than all the gold he had ever held, the quiet, unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, one day her heart would turn toward him of its own accord. But even if it never did, he knew he would be grateful, because she had given him the one thing no painting, no collection, no fortune could ever provide: the knowledge that the most valuable treasures in life are not those we purchase, but those we are entrusted with freely. And so the story of the millionaire and the street artist did not end with a contract or a possession. It ended with transformation. The man who once believed he could own the world discovered that the greatest joy was not ownership at all. It was love, elusive, untamed, and above all not for sale.